Hello, and welcome back to my channel, or maybe welcome for the first time. I am back today with a new watercolor and a couple of different concepts that I wanted to talk about. So today I am going to be painting from this photo reference that you can see in the upper left-hand corner. This is a photograph that I took myself, and I took this as I was walking into work. I actually work in that building that's kind of in the distance. And sometimes when I'm getting to work, I think especially right now because it's February, so even though I'm getting to work at about 8 o'clock in the morning, or maybe just a little bit earlier than that, the sun is still pretty low in the sky, and I am just always kind of awestruck by the different lighting effects that you'll see on different days, especially in the morning, probably in the evening too, but lately I have not been going out in the evening at all. So I wanted to talk today just a little bit about finding inspiration in your everyday world. And I think that sometimes that can be difficult. I know that I've struggled with that a lot because I live in Nebraska, just kind of in the middle of the state. And so we don't have any big mountains, we don't have forests. Really, what we have is the sky and very, very flat land, especially where I live. And I grew up here, and I know that I really struggled for a long time finding inspiration around me, kind of just feeling like my surroundings were not beautiful enough, and so always desiring to either be going other places, which I did a lot when I was younger. Of course, that's great. And also, I guess just looking at other people's photographs and wishing that I could genuinely turn those into my own paintings. And even though I do sometimes use photo references from websites like pixabay.com, where there are photo references that are free for you to use for any purpose that you want, I really have always struggled with that feeling of not feeling genuine about using photo references like that. So for the last couple of years, I have really tried to be a little bit more mindful about my surroundings and how unique it can be, or at least finding ways to make it unique for me. So that's what I'm going to be doing here, is just kind of talking a little bit about how I do that, to sometimes to a more effective degree than other times. And I think a lot of times it's really taking note of the little things. So what caught my eye and inspired me to snap a quick photograph with my phone here was just the way that the light was catching the branches and twigs of this tree and lighting them up almost like fire. You can see some parts of the tree are just red. And so sometimes I catch little things like that, and I have to just stop and take a picture. In this case, I was actually walking into the building. Other times, though, I'll be literally driving down the road, and I'll see something, and if it's safe for me to pull over, I will. Sometimes I'll even take an intentional detour on the way to work. I'll leave a little bit earlier so that I can take gravel roads to work, and then I feel a lot less weird and a lot more safe about just pulling over my car and even getting out and just snapping a few pictures. So I think it's really important just to start noticing small things around you. I think that good art doesn't always have to be like a grand mountainscape. It doesn't have to be an ocean or a beach or, these kind of dramatic, breathtaking scenes, these kind of getaway places where I can't afford to live. So I think it's really important just to start seeing the beauty around you wherever you are and boosting that through your art, I think, a little bit. I think a big part of the artist's job is to help guide other people to see what we are seeing and the little things that we're inspired by. I know that I'm one of those people who I really try to find beauty in everything. I grew up on a farm, and so I think that one big thing for me is all the different farm equipment and machinery. A lot of us don't really look at that even if we're around it all the time and realize how amazing it all is and how it just all comes together. Or sometimes I know I've been out on the farm and I used to help milk the cows. And so I would go out at like 4 o'clock in the morning and there wouldn't be any light really, but because it was out in the country, I'd just be completely overwhelmed by how many stars there were in the sky. Or when we would get done milking, it would only be like 6 o'clock in the morning or 6:30 in the morning. And so walking back in and seeing the sunrise and how the light bounces off all the tractors and just kind of really lights things up in a way that I can't really describe to you, but I do have lots of photos that I will hopefully be painting from in videos in the near future. So I think that that's just a really important thing because we can't all live in like, a coastal town. We can't all live in a mountain town. Some of us live in the middle of America and we might sometimes feel a little bit bored and uninspired by our surroundings. But I think it's really important to make art part of your life and part of just appreciating what you have. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about that. Oh, also, I am trying out a microphone, so I'm really curious for any kind of feedback you guys might give me as far as the sound quality. I learned a hard lesson that if I have my phone, which I do all of my video recording and editing on my phone, if I have my phone plugged into the charger and I'm doing a voiceover with this microphone, the microphone almost picks up on the electricity going into my phone. And so I'm actually doing this voiceover for the second time. And I'm hoping that it just improves my sound quality overall and hopefully doesn't just amplify all the noises that my dogs are making in the background. So I'm curious as far as your feedback. This microphone was only $15, so I won't be heartbroken if it's not a huge improvement. But, I'm trying new things. I'm trying to improve things. Okay, so I am a little bit behind on just kind of walking you through this painting, so let me get you caught up. I started out with just kind of an all-over wash of Payne's Gray. That's what I'm using instead of blue. Even though the sky in my photo reference is pretty blue, I really wanted to emphasize the red on the tree, and so I didn't want to have too much saturation elsewhere in this painting. And this photograph was taken just a couple of days ago in February, so when I think of the winter months, especially here in Nebraska, I don't really think of like blue skies because it almost makes it seem warmer than it really is. It's very cold and frigid right now. And even though there's not a lot of snow on the ground in this photograph, you can kind of see some in the distance. Nebraska is just one of those places where we get a little bit of snow and then it partially melts and just kind of, I don't want to say it's ugly, but it is. It's kind of ugly just to have like half snow all the time, but that's kind of how it is here. But anyway, I really wanted to emphasize this kind of fiery look on the tree, and so I'm using the Payne's Gray to create a more subdued sky, and I'm also using the Payne's Gray on the ground because I don't even want the grass to look as green in my painting as it does in the photograph. So I'm using that Payne's Gray to kind of set down a very neutral, cool gray, and then I'm building off of that. And then I went over the ground with a glazing layer of yellow ochre. And now I'm using some Purell red. This is the same red that I used in the branches of the tree, but I'm just using it right now very light, very watery for the building in the distance. And I will go over that a little bit later to kind of darken it up. And then the other concept that I really wanted to talk about was something that I have always struggled with, and that is trees. So you can see that this tree already at this point is kind of looking very intricate, but I do want you to notice that as I am painting the outer twigs of the tree where we just have like clusters of really tiny twigs, I am not going in and painting individual little twigs back there. What I'm doing is using a dry brush technique, And I'm basically just scumbling in masses of twigs. And massing, I think, is a really important concept when it comes to trees, whether the tree has leaves on it or it's bare and you can see every twig. It's really easy for us, especially if we're working with a photo reference, to start noticing every single little branch and twig, but you'll drive yourself crazy trying to paint all of that detail. So what I do when I do trees is I focus more on the primary shape of the tree, so the trunk, the larger branches, and then as you move outward and you get these clusters of twigs, I don't even try to attempt to paint individual lines for those twigs. I turn my brush to the side, and without much water on the brush, I just start scumbling in or dry brushing in some masses, and that comes together to kind of create those bunches of twigs. So now I'm using Payne's Gray and Purell Red to go over that building just to make it look a little bit more natural. I debated on whether or not to even include the building, but essentially I felt like it was important because these buildings are actually buildings that were constructed during World War II. This is a naval ammunition depot originally, and now it is a community college. And I got to learn a little bit about the history of this whole area, and I thought it was really interesting, and I think it's important to keep those things in. Even though it's kind of a plain brick building, it's not super interesting, but it is just kind of part of the story of this scene. Now I'm going to go in and darken the parts of the trunk and the branches and a few of the larger twigs, make them a little bit darker so that I get more contrast. And having this interesting juxtaposition of the dark colors and then the bright red on the tree creates almost like a layered effect on the tree, and I think it just makes it look really interesting. Actually, this is one of those situations too where I think that there's potential for the painting to be even more interesting and beautiful than the photo reference. And that's why it's really important just to approach painting as kind of tilting things toward your vision for how you want it to be and not necessarily trying to copy or mimic the photograph. You already have the photograph, so the painting is really your opportunity to improve on the photograph and better focus on what you found special in that scene. And I gotta tell you, sometimes I will take a photograph and I'll go back and look at it several days later and I won't even remember why I took the photo, because cameras, as wonderful as they are, and I'm not complaining about cameras at all, but I'm not a photographer, first of all, and I really don't even have an interest in photography. And so if you're an amateur like me taking photos, it's really easy to lose sight of what it was that you were inspired by in the first place, because cameras tend to constrain values, they kind of flatten things out. They make your darks and shadows way too dark in the photograph. They blow out the light areas, make them almost completely white. So I think it's really important to not only take photo references yourself, but to spend just a moment reflecting on why you're taking this photograph and kind of commit that to memory so that when you come back to it, whether it's later that day or it's a few days later, or even a long time from then, you kind of will have something sparked inside of you and you'll kind of remember what inspired you, and you'll be able to fill in the gaps just with your memory of that moment and also your imagination. So now I'm just adding a couple of details to this building back here. I think that I actually drew it too large, but that's okay. This building doesn't even really have any windows or anything on it. It's extremely plain, but I didn't want to embellish it much at all, so just going to kind of keep it as it is. And then I think too, those distant trees. So if you remember from the way that I began this painting, I really started everything with Payne's Gray to varying degrees. So some things I left a little bit lighter, some things I left darker. And those trees in the distance are definitely going to need to be a lot darker. So I'm going back in now with some more Payne's Gray, darkening the ground, of course, to add a little bit more contrast there. I know that it's going to help when I add some of the small trees in front of the building. It's going to kind of help to push that building a little bit back into the distance so it stops taking up quite as much visual space. And there I am darkening up those distant trees. Trying to get rid of some of the really stark whites in the foreground as well. Because, and two, I think another thing that I sometimes struggle with, and I think we all struggle with when using photo references, is how much information do we translate literally from the photograph to our painting. So I already mentioned that there's just a little bit of snow in the distance, and it's not like a beautiful snow, it's just kind of like gross leftover snow that refuses to melt no matter how many days that we have where it's 40 degrees and up. So I could be really literal about this painting and leave all that snow really in there, but I'm going to try to just subdue it a little bit, trying to find a little bit of a happy medium between being true to the reality of this time and place, but you know, I don't want it to be obvious that there's just a bunch of like leftover white snow back there. So I went over it a little bit with some Payne's Gray, and I'm spending more time just on the ground, kind of trying to get this very subdued green that says, hey, you know, it's winter, things are not really growing right now, but it's also not snowy. And two, it's important to think about shadow. So there's not a real strong cast shadow in the photograph by this tree, but I just happen to remember, well, and it's just common sense, the sun was rising in the east. So the left of my painting, or the left of the photograph, that is the east. And so that is why that side of the tree is a lot more red. It's getting a lot more light from that low sun. And so there's going to be just a little bit of a cast shadow over on the right of the tree. And that, just adding that little detail helps make things feel a little bit more grounded and natural. So now I'm just going and kind of touching things up, adding just a tiny bit of yellow to those distant trees where the sun is catching them just up at the top. And just kind of looking for any other little adjustments that I need to make. Again, it's important to know too that when you're working from a photo reference, you can just paint forever because you can see so much detail. So I think that you have to kind of decide where you're going to stop. So I'm adding just a little bit more yellow to the ground where the sun is hitting the ground a little bit without making things too bright and too green. I didn't use this sienna color really at all. Just going to add it a little bit to the trunk. It's really not even noticeable. It doesn't really, to me, look any different than mixing my Purell red with my yellow ochre, to be quite honest. But I figured I'd try it out. So the colors that I used for this were the Payne's Gray, yellow ochre, Purell red, some sepia. Mostly the sepia, right as you can see here, I used it in the darker areas on the trunk and the branches, and then I used just a little bit of sienna, but really didn't make much of a difference and was kind of unnecessary. All right, so I think that I am just about finished with this painting here. Just doing a few little touch-ups, adding a little bit of dimension up at the top. And I think that the last thing, that I'm going to do is just add a little bit of yellow ochre. I think I'm going to add a little bit actually to those clusters of branches up at the top just to give a little bit of a golden feel to that area on the tree. But we'll see. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure that I do that. It's a mystery. Oh, and by the way, someone commented that they were curious to see how I set things up to do videos, because I mentioned in my last video that a lot of times I like to go and rewatch my videos just to kind of remind myself how I painted something. Here I go with some of that gold up at the top. It's very subtle but effective. So yeah, I am going to make a video this week about how I set up to record myself, because even if you don't want to post videos on YouTube, it's just a great way to kind of reflect on your own process. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks so much, and goodbye.